listener production.
A warning. This episode references violence and sexual abuse of children. Please listen with care.
Hello, I'm Dan Mullins, executive producer of Crime Insiders. Welcome to our Rewind series, where each Wednesday we feature an episode from our back catalogue. This week, using insects to help solve crimes.
Professor Gail Anderson is Canada's first ever full-time forensic entomologist and has been working in the field for nearly 35 years. She's worked in criminal investigations for decades and most recently has been involved with the Innocence Project in helping overturn several wrongful convictions.
When it all began, Steven was a 14-year-old boy. In 1959, his father was in the Royal Canadian Air Force or worked within the Air Force. And so Steven grew up on a small Air Force base in Clinton, Ontario, which is quite a small rural area. In 1959, he was accused and convicted of the rape and murder of his 12-year-old classmate, Lynn Harper, and he was sentenced to death. And basically the story is this. Steven was a schoolboy and Lynn was a schoolmate of his. They were all playing around on the base one evening. Lynn ate her dinner very hurriedly at about 5:45. I think she finished her meal. And she gulped it. She didn't chew it properly. She wanted to get out. She said she was going for a walk. Well, she wasn't. She was going to hitchhike into town, like all the kids did. Everybody suggested she would never have done such a thing because she was a good girl. Well, yeah, sure she was a good girl, but all the kids hitchhiked. They just didn't tell mum and dad. It was the only way to get out of town. So she went to the local school where Steven was messing around with a bunch of his friends. And Steven was on his bicycle, which he was always on. And she said she was going to go up the hill and hitchhike. And so Steven said, well, I'll give you a ride. So he gave her a ride on his bicycle to the top of the hill. So he'll get off his bicycle and get into the car of what he assumed was one of the army people, one of the Air Force base, because he saw an Air Force cap in the back window and he was driving an Air Force Jeep. Nobody ever saw her alive again. He came back and was with his friends. There was a half-hour period, just a half-hour period, where he was in contact with Lynn. Every time after that, for the next 48 hours, he was fully alibied by lots of other people. When her body was found 2 days later, she had insects infesting her. She was taken to an autopsy where she was autopsied by Dr. Peniston. And Peniston determined her time of death. And he came up with about 5 different times of death. At least 3, I think he testified to. And he kept changing his mind. But eventually he managed to land it on exactly that half-hour period that Steven had contact with her. Now, you just can't do that. There's nothing with time of death that you can come to that specific time frame. He used decompositional stages like rigor mortis, and he used the level of digestion in her stomach. Neither of those are specific. They can give you a general idea, but they can't get you to a half-hour time frame. They just cannot. Many, many variables, particularly with digestion. She gulped her food. She didn't chew it very, very well. If she was running or scared or fighting for her life, that stops digestion. So all of these things were known back then. They were mentioned in court, but Dr. Peniston was a very convincing witness, and everybody believed him. And Steven was convicted almost entirely, absolutely. And we still see this today. And this became a very, very major case in Canada because although at the time everybody believed Steven was guilty, it really shocked the Canadian public at the very thought that Canadians, not Americans, not Texans, Canadians would execute a child. And so although nobody thought he was innocent, the thought that we would actually go that far, that we would kill a child for whatever he'd done. Now, obviously, Steven is alive today, so he was not executed. He was convicted. He went into a maximum security adult male prison. And 4 months later, the Diefenbacher government in 1960 commuted it to life imprisonment. He spent that 10 years in prison in a maximum security adult prison, and then very quietly, after 10 years, was released. There was no pomp and ceremony. He was just quietly released. He married. He had children. He became a millwright. He took his mother's maiden name. He lived a quiet, unassuming life. But he didn't want to be obscure. He wanted his children, his sons, to have his name. He wanted to use the name Truscott again. Now, in 1966, a reporter called Isabelle Lobato wrote a book about all the problems that had happened with the trial, including children not being allowed to speak, evidence being suppressed, she claimed, strong biases involved, etc. Canada refused to publish the book, and it was published in Britain. That kind of shamed Canada into publishing it. Canada published it, and again there was an outcry because everybody had remembered Steven Truscott and remembered we'd almost executed a boy, and now there's a thought that we might have almost executed an innocent boy. And so there was a great outcry. So there was I don't know if you call it a second trial, but there was a re-examination of the case, and the original verdict was upheld. And that was about it until many, many, many years later, in 1997, when DNA was becoming much more commonly thought of, and Steven stepped forward and said he would like his DNA to be tested because material had been collected. But unfortunately, after 1966, all the evidence was destroyed. And so nothing could be done. In 2000, the CBC Fifth Estate, it's a TV show which is very strongly investigative journalism, and they looked into this case, and again, they looked at a lot of the biases and the mistakes that were made. They called me in at that time too, and eventually in 2006, there was a call for another look at it. And people had not forgotten. This was a very big case. So again, the thought that we almost executed a child, and that child might have been innocent. And so at this point, 5 Supreme Court judges were asked to reevaluate everything. And that's when I was called in, together with 4 other forensic entomologists and pathologists.
What sort of defence did a 14-year-old boy have?
Well, I think he had a reasonably decent defence in that they brought in experts to say, you can't do that with decomposition. You can't do that with digestion, even back in 1959. But Penniston was very convincing. And we see this today. Juries like somebody who comes in and is very strong, male, I hate to say it, but white, older, and very, very decisive. They don't want people to say, well, I'm not sure, we can't really do that.
Because that doesn't help them make a decision.
Yeah, the jury and the judge wants to know what they should think. And of course, it's a complicated case, and it's easier if somebody tells you for sure this is what it is. The judge was incredibly prejudiced. He put down every word defense said. He put him down at every point. When he didn't think the jury was buying prosecution's case, he would postulate to the jury the way he thought Steven had killed her, with no evidence whatsoever. I mean, that should have been thrown out right then and there. There were so many cases, parts that this should have been thrown out. Some of the words that the pathologist used were incredibly prejudicial. I mean, I'm not even allowed in court to refer to the term victim, because that suggests somebody was killed.
What do you have to say instead?
The decedent, the deceased person. Victim suggests that nasty person there killed her. You try to use as neutral language as possible. And if I said, or if anybody said some of the phrases he used, they were so prejudicial. You talk about this horrific, according to Penniston's, rape that was committed in very, very graphic terms. I don't need to go into it here, but extremely graphic terms. And then you all turn around and look at this boy. It was incredibly prejudicial. As well, certain witnesses were not allowed to testify. They agreed. They saw her getting into that Jeep. So some of the children were coached to very much speak about what the prosecution wanted them to say. But the big thing from my point of view is that insects were observed. They were mentioned in the pathology report. Penniston referred to them many times. They were collected. They were analysed, and then were never used in court. So all that evidence was there right at the time, back in 1959, and it wasn't used. Unfortunately, in 1966, after the re-examination, they were all destroyed. And so when I was called in, and the other entomologists were called in, we had no actual evidence to look at. What we had was descriptions by the pathologists, which included measurements. We had the report that was, or the notes, that were written. So we were all able to work with all the species and do a really broad analysis. We knew the weather records. We have developmental data. We know the stages, and we also have the measurements. And then we have developmental data for those insects. So we were able to look at that, and it's a very, very long story here, so I won't go into it. But basically, 4 of us all agreed that time of death could be the time they said, which was about 7:30 in the evening. But we extended it right through the entire next day to the evening of the following day. Now, I suggested at the time, it's very, very difficult to give a maximum time of death because I don't know if the body's been in a freezer. I've done many cases like that. So I can give you a minimum time of death, but not usually a maximum. And so minimum time of death was that she'd been dead about 24 hours. She'd been missing about 40 hours. But the big question was, could we eliminate that time frame, that half-hour period? Well, in general, no, we can't. In all our opinions, we couldn't exactly. But I suggested to prosecution, and remember, I'm being called by prosecution, and I'd like to point out that when you're an expert witness, you are not there for whoever called you. I'm not there to speak to prosecution. I'm not there to bolster their case, nor am I there to bolster or put down defense's case. I'm there simply to explain the science to the trier of fact. That is the judge or the jury. So I can be called by either side, but my evidence might not support either, or it might support the other side, or it might support the side that calls me. That's not up to me. I'm the expert witness. I'm just going to explain the science to the people who actually make those decisions. It's not up to me. So an expert witness should never have any bias towards either side. Unfortunately, it doesn't always work that way, but that's the way it should be. So we're just trying to explain what the insects can tell us. Well, one of the questions we were asked was, can you eliminate the time that Steven was with her? That 30-minute period? Well, normally no, but what I suggested to prosecution was we recreate the scene. This place still exists. She was found in a farmer's field in a little dell, a little copse of trees. It's still there. Nothing has changed. It's still farmed. And so we could recreate it using animal carcasses, practically to the day. Prosecution did not like that idea at all. I don't know why. Perhaps they were scared of what I would find, but they didn't like that idea. But one of the main people called by defense was Dr. Shera van Leerhoven, who was my very first graduate student. So she comes from my lab. So we think the same. And so the first thing she said is, why don't we do a recreation? And defense said, great idea. So we designed this experiment. So she got pig carcasses, freshly killed pig carcasses from a slaughterhouse, and she placed them out there almost at exactly the same time. It's amazing. 48 years later that she placed the pig carcasses out. And the idea was if Lynn had died between 7 and 7:30 that evening, would flies still have laid eggs, or was it too late in the evening? They're really daytime kind of animals. It was still daylight, of course, in June, but would they have laid eggs then, or would they have waited till the next morning? And so if they had laid eggs at 7 to 7:30, those insects that we saw on the body would have been way older. They would have been at least 12 hours more older than what we saw. If, on the other hand, the body could have laid there all night and no insects would have been laid at 7 o'clock in the evening, they wouldn't have been laid till the next morning, and that would fit with our scenario and could not eliminate Steven. So Shera repeated the scenario with pig carcasses, and she observed flies laying eggs almost immediately. Lots of them. Now, that doesn't prove anything, but it strongly suggests that had Lynn been there during that time frame, eggs would have been laid very quickly and the insects we dealt with would have been older. Doesn't prove it, but strongly suggests it. And that, therefore, our widened window of time strongly suggests that Lynn may have died later that night or even the next day. But we cannot say that she could only have died within the half-hour period.
Was he involved in any of this process?
He was interviewed in the CBC Fifth Estate. So he came out of obscurity at that time. Everybody now knows who he is and what he looks like. All his friends know who he is. And I'd like to point out that he started this with the request for DNA. I think that speaks volumes. He was going on with his life. He had children, I think grandchildren, but he's still fighting for his innocence. And I think from the beginning that speaks volumes that he knew he was innocent.
In terms of Steven, after all of this, if you've widened the window of possible death to including periods when Steven had supportive alibis, how did that raise enough reasonable doubt to overturn the decision?
Because the entire decision was based on time of death. There was no evidence against him whatsoever. None whatsoever. You know, I always tell my students to look at the evidence. There was no evidence. There was no physical evidence. There was a lot of evidence to suggest he didn't do it, that she got into that Jeep, that other kids saw her get into that Jeep, that he came back down on his bicycle 25 minutes later looking like a perfectly normal, affected, unworried 14-year-old boy, not like a boy who's just raped a girl and murdered her. I believe there were lots of other things that were just ignored in the court, such as she was covered in a lot of branches and broken off branches that came from part of a tree. Stephen was not a very tall boy, and he couldn't have reached that up there. There was lots of things like that when you look at it properly. There was no evidence against Stephen. The only evidence was he'd been seen with her for that half-hour period. And once you add time of death, that she must have died when Stephen was with her, well then, duh. But when you take that time frame away...
What do you think possibly motivated the judge to be so prejudicial?
I think they thought they'd got their boy and this was it.
So they didn't look anywhere else?
They didn't look anywhere else, and I think everybody was so sure of it. And isn't it horrific? This is a little small town and a little boy has killed a little girl. This is absolutely horrific.
And in terms of reopening the case, has that happened?
No. The Ontario Court of Appeal said they would not look into Stephen anymore. There would never be a retrial. And of course, it's well over 50 years ago now. But I mean, if I was the police officer, the first thing I would be looking at is who was driving that Jeep? Who took her? If you remove Stephen from the equation, and really, let's realistically assume it was an adult male that took and raped her, I would certainly be looking at him and anybody else on the base.
Coming up, being sentenced to 16 years in prison for a murder she didn't commit. It wasn't until the Innocence Project became involved that she was finally able to walk free.
Moving forward a few years now, and there's another case that you worked on for the Innocence Project. It's the case of Kirstin Blaise Lobato, who I think now prefers to go just by Blaise. Could you please tell us what happened in that case?
That was a really interesting case, and I think all power to Mr. Hans Scherer, who is the editor of a magazine for the wrongfully convicted. It's called Justice Denied, and he's just a regular guy. And he heard about this case. Now people know what forensic entomology is. It's quite easy to look at a cold case, flip through the photographs and see maggots all over the body and say, hey, did they call an entomologist? It's much more difficult to do the same and see no insects and say, hey, did they call an entomologist? So all power to him. Hans called me in December 2009 about an American case in Las Vegas, Nevada. And in this case, back many years ago, back on the 8th of July, 2001, a homeless man, Mr. Duran Bailey, was found brutally murdered behind the Palms Casino Resort in like an outside trash receptacle area. And by brutally, I mean brutally. He had been stabbed. He had been slashed. He had been cut to pieces. He was lying in a bloodbath. His penis had been cut off twice, which is clever, but whoever did it took a second slash, and then his rectum had been cut open. He was just a bloodbath. He was found at just after 10 o'clock at night, 10:15 at night remember it's July, in Nevada, so it would have been dark by then. And he was processed there and taken away. Sometime later, the police got onto their police database and did a little check and said, we're missing a penis here. Do we have any penis slashes? And they come across this kid. I think she was about 17, 18 at the time. Kirstin Blaise Lobato. Blaise had, about a month earlier, been attacked by a man. Not this man, a totally different man. Attacked by a man and grabbed and hauled into, I think, a motel room and attacked at knife point. And he was in the process of trying to rape her. Now picture the scene. He is in process of raping her. She carries a little teeny-weeny little knife, like a little pen knife, Swiss Army knife kind of thing on a keychain that her dad gave her years ago. And she just carries it like as a talisman. She's always got it in her pocket. She manages to get it out, get it open, and she cuts him. Guess where she cuts? He's in process of raping her. Now, she doesn't cut it off, but she leaves him, I quote, crying. So when they find this guy minus a penis, this kid comes up. So they go to her family home and they interview her, and they don't make their questions very, very clear, shall we say. So when they start to talk about a guy missing a penis and dying, she thinks they're talking about the guy a month ago the guy that tried to rape her. She thinks she killed him. So she's horrified. So she expresses remorse. She says, I'm sorry. Prosecution takes that as a de facto confession to the assault and murder of Mr. Bailey. And that was pretty much the case against her. There's no other evidence. She was fully alibied for almost all of the day. She was tried and convicted in the original case, which I believe was in 2002, and she was convicted of first-degree murder, and also sexual penetration of a dead body. Now, that sexual penetration of a dead body was the cutting open of the rectum. And that was believed to have occurred, and she was accused and convicted of it occurring after he died. So in other words, she's accused of murdering him and then sexually mutilating the body. And that was a wrongful charge. Wrongful from both prosecution and defense's case. Both of them agreed that, unfortunately for the victim, he was alive when the rectum was cut open. Hopefully he was unconscious, but he was alive. Now that just means it's part of the murder. You know, if you stab somebody once or 50 times, you're only charged with first-degree murder once, not 50 times. So if you cut his rectum while he was alive, it's part of the killing. If you cut him afterwards, then it becomes a sexual offence, and then they become a sexual offender. So she was wrongfully convicted of that charge because the charge was wrongful, but she was still convicted of it. Well, they discovered an awful lot of errors with that case, and the case was overturned. But she was still retried. She was retried in 2006. And this time she was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter and sexual penetration of a dead body. There's that wrongful charge again. And she was sentenced to 13 to 45 years in prison. Don't you love American prison sentences? And if she was ever released, she would then be a sexual offender and be on a list for the rest of her life. As I say, in 2009, I was called in, and Hans said, you know, you're an entomologist. I heard about entomology in another big case recently. There's no insects. Can you do anything? And I said, well, do you have any evidence? He said, no evidence whatsoever, but I've got photographs. Well, normally I would just say no. In fact, that's what I said at first. I said, I can't do anything with photographs. Any more than a doctor can take a vial of your blood and hold it up to the light and say, unless there's something very wrong with you. You can't just look at that vial of blood. You have to run a few tests. Well, I need to run a few tests. I need the actual insects. I need to put them under a microscope, that kind of stuff. But he said there was no evidence. Nothing was collected. And he showed me the photographs, and he said that they're saying, now, pathologist again changes his mind on time of death about 5 times during different trials and in different write-ups, again and again and again. And at least 3 times in court, he gave a different time frame. And there was no lawyer there who said, excuse me, why have you changed your mind? I mean, you can change your mind. Sometimes evidence changes. I get told something the night before I go into court. I'm going to have to adjust my testimony, but I'm going to explain why my new testimony is different from my original report. And if I don't explain it, somebody should darn well ask me about it. Nobody asked him. I went through all the transcripts. At no point did anybody say, Dr. So-and-so, why have you changed your mind? So that was clearly a problem with the whole court proceedings. But the time of death, according to the pathologist and the one he kind of stuck with, was early in the morning of that date. And Hans showed me the photographs. There is absolutely no sign of insect activity. Now, blowflies will colonize a body pretty much immediately, within minutes or seconds usually, of death, if the conditions are appropriate. Now, blowflies need to be around, so it needs to be summer, spring, fall, or at least if you're in a tropical region, any time of the year. Insects need to be able to get to the body. Temperature needs to be above 10 degrees Celsius. It must not be absolutely pouring with rain because they're just a little insect. They could get knocked down when they actually lay their eggs. They must be able to access the body. So, you know, if it's buried 20 feet down in concrete, then they're not going to be able to get there. If it's in a situation such as inside a house, they're going to be delayed. They will get there, but they're going to be delayed. There's lots of different things that can affect when insects will get there. But if the conditions are appropriate, they'll get there very, very quickly. Now, one of the things, though, that will prevent them is blowflies are diurnal, like you and I. We're out during the day. We have big eyes. Think of all the cartoons and horror stories you've seen about flies. Big eyes. They use light. When it gets dark, when nighttime happens, they just shut down. They'll go and sit under leaves or they'll rest. When daytime starts again, they're not real early morning people. So even if the sun rises at 6 a.m, they're probably not going to get really active till 9 or 10. So in this case, you've got this guy he's found at 10:15. He is a bloodbath. He's got gaping open wounds. He's about as attractive to insects as you can get. I even asked if there'd been a pesticide spray because it is a tourist area. So they might have sprayed pesticides when Zika came up, the mosquito-transmitted virus a few years ago. I was in a massive insect conference, 6,000 or 7,000 entomologists from around the world, all in Florida, in Orlando. There wasn't an insect around. I saw one very sad-looking semi-alive flesh fly as I went to the airport. They had sprayed that place. They did not want a risk of Zika virus in a major tourist area. So we checked. No, there was no spray. The only thing that explained why there were no insects, no eggs, no nothing. And I mean, these are not microscopic things. They're about 1 or 2 millimeters long, and they will be laid in the wounds. And believe me, I've got excellent photographs of those wounds. In the orifices, you will see them. And they're not laid singly, they're laid in big clumps. So you get a clump like, Parmesan cheese or wood shavings or something like that. You can see them. These are easily shown in a photograph. They were not there. The only thing that explains it, because everything else is absolutely perfect for insect colonization, is that he died after sunset. Now, sunset there was at 8:10 that night. Civil twilight was at 8:31, which is when you have to have your headlights on by law. And nautical twilight was 9:08 p.m. when it's completely dark. Now, I know it's Vegas, so it's never completely dark, but it really is a true diurnal rhythm. Insects follow the actual real rhythm, not fake lights. For instance, an insect can tell whether the days are getting longer or getting shorter. So the only reason that he didn't have insects on him, in my opinion, was he died after sunset. And at that time, Miss Lobato had a completely solid alibi. Her family, but also lots of other people who had no bias. And so basically Hans fought using my affidavit, and it went on for years and years. At one point, there was a hearing, and I streamed it from my computer at home. It was only half an hour. There were several justices involved, and it was pitiful. Oh, did I mention the semen on his buttocks? It's never been tested. I guarantee Miss Lobato did not donate it. It was pitiful listening for defense, pleading for the DNA to be tested, and the judge all sputtering and saying, what, you think it could be somebody else? It's semen. She's a girl. This isn't difficult. They asked for the entomological evidence to be admitted, and it couldn't be admitted as new evidence because it wasn't used in the original trial. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but I kind of thought that was the whole point of new evidence. In 2017, Innocence Project got involved, and you have to cross a lot of barriers to even be considered by Innocence Project because they're so inundated by so many requests for miscarriage of justice analyses. And usually they will only do DNA ones because it's a slam dunk. If somebody was convicted in the 70s and we've still got DNA, we can get the DNA, slam dunk. You can prove whether they did it or they didn't do it very easily. But usually you're dealing with somebody who doesn't have the finances or the ability to get that DNA tested. Innocence Project does. So this was a really rare one to take on an entomology case. But they looked at the report and they were pretty sure that they had a solid case. And so Innocence Project got involved in 2017 in January. I met with them in February. And there was a hearing in the summer that granted her a re-examination. And I testified in Nevada Supreme Court. Again, not exactly a trial, a hearing. I also brought a couple of other American entomologists in. And I brought them in for a couple of reasons, one of which is very solid scientifically. The other one is a bit more facetious, but still valid judiciously. I'm not from Nevada. Now, neither are they. They don't have any local people doing forensic entomology there, but one of them was from Northern California, which is, as crow flies, as close as you can get. And the other one was admittedly from Texas, but highly experienced in cases, and so was very used to the American criminal justice system. The somewhat facetious reason was that Americans like to hear from Americans. It's very unusual because most of us like an expert witness to be, in fact, the facetious definition is somebody from away. And we brought somebody in from away. Whereas Americans in general prefer to hear from Americans. In fact, a colleague of mine, when she testified in the States, and in America, they can interview the jury afterwards. You can't in most places. But you can talk to the jury after the decision has been made. And so you can say, well, why didn't you trust them? And in one case where she testified, they said, well, they brought a Canadian in. They couldn't even find an American to do it. I'm not going to believe her. It's really, really upsetting and scary. And I mean, if you don't believe me, think of all those excellent British or Australian TV shows that made it big hits everywhere else. but didn't make it in America till it was translated into American. I give you Broadchurch as an example. If you haven't seen Broadchurch, excellent series. Didn't make it in America till the entire season was remade in American with the same broad Scottish actor, David Tennant, now playing an American detective with a fake American accent. Then it wins the awards. So I didn't want to be ignored simply because I wasn't an American. And so the three of us testified. And we're all of a somewhat different generation. We're all about at least 10 years apart in our education. We've all been educated in different places. And what the judge said she found the most compelling was the fact that we all, for a start, testified pro bono. We also all said exactly the same thing in different words, using different phrases, but we all said exactly the same thing. Blowflies do not fly at night, and they do not lay eggs at night. And that has been shown pretty much around the world. And so it's extremely unlikely that that body could have laid there during the entire day. Therefore, he likely died after sunset. And therefore, it's not up to us to say this, but the judge can figure it out that she was alibied at that time. 2 months later, in December, she was granted a retrial. And 10 days later, the court vacated the conviction entirely, saying she had inadequate defense because they did not call an entomologist nor a pathologist who could have quite clearly shown that her alibi, her very well evidenced alibi, showed she could not possibly have killed the guy. And she should be released immediately. Except there was a problem. During this time, she didn't know about it. She didn't know she'd been granted a new trial. She didn't know she'd been released. But they had every intention, having wrongfully kept her in prison for the last 16 or so years. By this point, she's 34. She was 18 when this started. Having wrongfully kept her in prison for all of these years, they intend to keep her in prison for 1 extra year on the grounds that she had a felony conviction for having consensual sex with a fellow female inmate early in her time in prison and was sentenced to an extra year in prison, for which they were planning on keeping her in, despite the fact she'd been wrongfully convicted and wrongfully kept in prison for those 16 years. And they were going to keep her to that 1 year for a crime that would not have been a crime had she not been wrongfully convicted in the first place. Hans Scherer said, "This is ridiculous. This is wrongful confinement. I'm calling the FBI. This is kidnapping." And on January the 2nd, 2018, she was released.
Gail, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you so much for sharing all the great work the Innocence Project is doing on top of all of your other work and your research and career highlights. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me today.
That's all we have time for in this Rewind episode. If you know someone who loves true crime, recommend our series to them. And check out our videos by searching Listener Crime on TikTok or Instagram. I'm Dan Mullins. Thanks for listening.